If you really look closely at things like foreign currencies or maybe commemorative coins and especially postage stamps, things we barely glance at, you realize they're actually saying quite a lot.
Oh, absolutely. They seem so mundane, don't they? Just little bits of paper or metal.
Exactly. But they're a subtle, sometimes really powerful way for a state to broadcast its values, its history, its achievements.
And maybe most importantly, its intentions, its goals. It's a form of government propaganda, often aspirational, maybe even outright false sometimes.
But it always reveals something about the people in charge, what they want the world and their own people to believe.
And today, we're taking that whole idea of state propaganda and smashing it right up against something incredibly persistent.
Right.
Nationalism.
Right.
We're doing a deep dive into this really perplexing, tangled relationship between communism, which is supposed to be internationalist, right? And this deep-seated national feeling, national conservatism.
And we've got a specific and, genuinely shocking historical artifact to anchor this from Romania, right in the middle of the Cold War.
Yeah, it's quite something. Our sources are looking at Romanian socialism, and it's probably worth reminding everyone just how brutal that period was.
Definitely. It's often described as one of the absolute worst examples of Marxism-Leninism anywhere in Europe. We're not just talking abstract ideology here.
No, not at all. Think about the Pateti prison experiments. That was between 1949 and 52. Just horrific psychological torture designed to completely break people.
And then later you get the sheer tyranny of Nicolae Ceausescu. So it's a backdrop of extreme repression.
Exactly. Keep that context of just profound state control and cruelty in mind. Okay, so let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because given that level of state barbarism, the source points out something incredible, an anomaly.
Which is?
That the former Eastern Bloc states, generally speaking, managed to hold on to their conservative and nationalist tendencies much more strongly than the Western American aligned states did.
Wait, really? More strongly?
Yes. Even after the Soviet Union collapsed, you see these nations retaining their national culture, their identity, even their religiosity to a surprising degree compared to the West.
Okay, that is a paradox. That's the central puzzle we need to figure out today.
It really is. Because it feels completely counterintuitive, doesn't it?
Totally. Communism is so often blamed, maybe rightly, maybe wrongly, for pushing globalism, national guilt, militant atheism, that whole package.
Right.
So how on earth did these socialist states, supposedly puppets of Moscow, manage to keep their national identity and culture so intact? Why didn't the ideology just steamroll it, especially when the state had, absolute power?
Well, what's fascinating here, and what the sources dig into, is that you have to see the subtle but really profound difference between the Soviet Union's own internal policy and the policies applied in its satellite states, like Romania.
Okay, so different rules for the core versus the periphery.
Pretty much. Inside the USSR itself, the main goal, the ideological mission, was creating the new communist man. This wasn't just talk.
What did it mean in practice?
It meant that old ethnic identities, and even their physical traits, were supposed to eventually disappear through miscegenation, through deliberate ethnic mixing or amalgamation.
Wow. So the Soviets were actively trying to engineer ethnicity out of existence within their own borders to break down those traditional ties.
That's the argument, yes. And crucially, this was specifically aimed at weakening Russian ethnic and cultural dominance, Russian hegemony.
Why target the Russians specifically? You'd think they'd promote the core group.
Because the Soviet leadership apparently saw Russianism, a strong Russian identity, as a major threat, a liability.
How so?
Because a distinct, historically rooted Russian identity could offer a real, tangible alternative to the artificial Soviet identity they were trying to build. It was competition.
I see. So Russian nationalism was an internal ideological challenger that had to be dismantled, first maybe through terror, then through this kind of managed mixing.
Exactly. They had to eliminate that powerful internal alternative. Yeah. It makes the Soviet project seem quite different from just Russian imperialism in communist clothes.
That really reframes things. Okay, so that was the USSR internally. What about the satellite states then? Romania, Poland, Hungary.
Right. Contrast that with the satellites. Their ethnic dilution, this kind of mixing, was generally not official government policy.
So they weren't trying to blend Romanians and Hungarians and Poles into some new socialist ethnicity?
No. Socialism there aimed for a union of different peoples fighting for the same cause, sure, but not necessarily becoming one single homogenized ethnic group.
But why the difference? Why tolerate distinct nations there?
Well, ironically, it seems it was necessary to uphold a core claim of Marxism itself, that the ideology had to be universally true, applicable to everyone, everywhere.
Okay. How does that connect?
Think about it. If you theoretically had to be genetically changed or ethnically blended to become a proper socialist, then Marxism wouldn't be universal, would it?
Ah, it would mean the ideology only works for certain groups, or only after some kind of biological alteration. It would falsify the whole premise.
Precisely. So the ideology's claim to universal truth, paradoxically, required respecting or at least tolerating the existence of distinct nations outside the Soviet core.
That is the pivot, the aha moment. So
Yeah.
the USSR crushes Russian nationalism internally for its own survival, but allows Romanian, Polish, and other nationalisms to persist externally to prove Marxism's universal reach.
It seems that way. This need to prove universality acted almost like a shield, allowing national cultures and the satellites to endure under the communist umbrella.
Which brings us to where it gets really interesting because we have physical proof of this nationalist persistence bubbling up.
Yes, and the most striking, almost unbelievable example supporting this whole argument is a postage stamp. Just a little postage stamp, produced by communist Romania in 1962, deep in the Cold War.
1962, okay. And this stamp commemorated two men. Two men who, by any communist standard, should have been erased from history, denounced, purged.
Absolutely. It honored the, quote, martyric deaths of Ion Moya and Vasil Marin.
And who were Moya and Marin? Why is honoring them under communism so completely shocking?
Well, they weren't just, minor dissenters. They were central, almost saint-like figures in Cornelius Zelia Codreanu's Legion of the Archangel Michael.
Which most people know as the Iron Guard.
Exactly, the Iron Guard.
Yeah.
A movement that was fiercely nationalist, deeply religious, mystical, anti-communist, anti-Semitic, basically the absolute polar opposite of everything the communist state stood for.
And the circumstances of their deaths are critical here, too.
Absolutely critical. Moya and Marin were passionate anti-communists. They volunteered to fight in the Spanish Civil War.
On Franco's side.
On Franco's nationalist side, yes. Against the Spanish Republicans, who were directly backed by the Soviet Union. They died fighting against the communists in Spain in 1937.
And they became huge martyrs for the fascist and far-right cause across Europe at the time. Huge funerals, thousands mourning them.
Precisely. So for the Romanian communist state to turn around 25 years later in 1962 and issue a stamp honoring these specific figures, it's just mind-boggling.
It really is. And the stamp itself wasn't subtle. It wasn't just their names on a list or something.
Not at all. The source describes the imagery, and it's incredible. Yes, it had their portraits, but it also included a very clear image of the Archangel Michael,
Okay.
holding a shield emblazoned with the legionary cross, the specific symbol of the Iron Guard.
Wow. No mistaking that.
None. And on top of that, the bold phrase, Cruciati Europae,
Crusaders of Europe?
Crusaders of Europe. I mean, you genuinely could not design a more explicit promotion of the religious, mystical, nationalist antithesis of Marxism-Leninism and put it on state-issued currency.
It's completely stunning, which forces the question why.
That's the core question, yes.
Yeah.
Remember, the Iron Guard itself had been banned in Romania since 1941. Under communism, former members weren't just banned, they were rounded up, executed, tortured in places like Batay. They represented everything the regime opposed.
Orthodox Christianity, Romanian traditionalism, fierce nationalism.
A complete counter-ideology. Yet, 1962, here comes this stamp from a regime supposedly built on total ideological control, honoring key figures of that very enemy.
It just breaks every rule of totalitarian censorship we think we know. So why? Why risk it? What was the motive? The source suggests a couple of possibilities.
It does. Was it perhaps that public admiration for Moya and Marin, these national figures, was just too strong, too persistent to ignore completely? Did the regime feel it had to make a concession?
Or maybe it was something more calculated, a kind of historical revisionism by certain Romanian officials, trying to subtly reclaim parts of the national story, even the controversial part.
That's the other possibility floated. If we connect this back to the bigger picture, we were discussing the difference between Soviet and satellite policy.
Right, the tolerance for distinct nations and the satellites.
It suggests a limit to how much ideology can suppress a deeply rooted national identity. Even though the USSR was the ultimate guarantor of Romania's socialist system, and they certainly could have stopped this stamp.
They didn't.
Apparently not. They tolerated it. The mere fact the stamp was produced suggests, as the source puts it, that the soul of the Romanian people could not be suppressed. It forced the official ideology to bend, to accommodate it, even in this really overt way.
So it's like the Communist Party, feeling secure in its power, perhaps thought it could co-opt or patronize this nationalism, absorb it almost.
Possibly. Maybe they felt nationalism was potent, but ultimately subordinate to the truth of communism.
Yeah.
That communism was so encompassing it could even find a historical context, for figures who explicitly fought against it. Maybe they viewed them as tragic, misguided Romanian heroes whose energy should have been communist.
Wow. Okay, and this leads to a modern irony that the source points out, which is just staggering.
It really is. So what does this mean for Romania today?
Well, the irony is that modern democratic Romania, the post-communist Romania, has since passed laws that criminalize promoting the Iron Guard's ideology and its symbols.
Which is often part of dealing with the fascist past and decommunization efforts common across Eastern Europe.
Right, but the direct consequences.
The direct consequence is that this 1962 communist-era postage stamp, the one with the Archangel Michael and the Legionary Cross and Crusaders of Europe,
That stamp would now be illegal to display or promote in today's free and democratic Romania.
let that sink in. What was permitted under totalitarian socialism is now banned under liberal freedom.
That is an incredible contradiction. Why would the democratic state, the post-Soviet state, be more restrictive about these historical symbols than the communists were back in '62?
The source offers a really thought-provoking analysis here. One surface explanation is perhaps the communists in '62 saw the Iron Guard as politically dead, finished, no longer a threat, just historical figures to be maybe reinterpreted or neutralized through inclusion. Whereas today, in a pluralistic democracy, those same symbols, that same ideology, might be seen as capable of finding new life, of becoming an active political force again. So, paradoxically, the democratic state feels a greater need to suppress it legally.
Because the threat feels more real in an open society.
Possibly. But the source argues something deeper is going on. It suggests that when socialism tries to absorb or assimilate something that it recognizes, perhaps implicitly, as truer and more powerful than itself, things like nationhood, faith, deep historical memory, it ultimately fails.
It can't contain it.
It can't truly synthesize it without contradicting its own core tenets. The tension between communism and this kind of traditionalism doesn't strengthen communism. It exposes its limitations and, the source argues, contributes to its eventual downfall. It tries to be everything and ends up being undermined by the things it can't fully digest.
And this wasn't just a weird Romanian quirk either. The source brings up another example, right?
Yeah, a really interesting parallel from the DDR, East Germany, another militantly atheistic socialist state.
And they were promoted.
They actively promoted figures like Thomas Müntzer, a radical Christian reformer, preacher, theologian from centuries ago, a deeply religious figure tied to German history.
So even there, the supposedly anti-religious state had to find ways to incorporate these powerful, historical, even religious national figures into its narrative.
It seems so. Socialism, despite its official doctrines, maybe discourages a lot, but also has this capacity for begrudging tolerance. Perhaps based on the belief that if communism is the ultimate historical truth, then somehow even the nation's past heroes, including anti-communists or religious figures, can eventually be folded into the story of progress towards communism.
But as history showed, that attempt to be all things to all people didn't quite work out. It seems the enduring power of the nation, of that identity, couldn't be fully assimilated or replaced.
Exactly. It ultimately exposed a flaw in the ideology's claim to universality when confronted with these deep-rooted loyalties.
So this whole deep dive, looking at the stamp, it really shows how even state propaganda, things designed to shape reality, can accidentally reveal a more complex truth about the limits of power, doesn't it?
It really does.
We've seen how an ideology like Marxism, supposedly internationalist to its core, slams right into the brick wall of national identity. And sometimes, incredibly, the ideology is the one that has to bend or break.
And the source wraps this up with a really powerful and, you have to say, quite controversial conclusion.
Okay, what's the final takeaway?
It essentially argues that while liberal society today is permissive, often in a way that serves individual desires, consumerism, maybe even selfishness, when it comes to what is collectively best for the preservation and continuation of tradition of the nation itself, socialism.
Go on.
Socialism, the source argues, is paradoxically, arguably preferable.
Whoa, hold on. Preferable? How could it possibly argue that? After acknowledging the brutality, the Pertay prisons, the sheer terror used against traditionalists and nationalists, how is that system better at preserving tradition?
It's a very specific and unsettling argument. The source isn't excusing the brutality. It's focusing purely on the system's structural ability, because of its absolute power, to resist external homogenizing forces, like global consumer culture or supranational identities.
So, because communism was a closed system, it could, in theory, shield national culture better than an open liberal system constantly bombarded by global influences.
That seems to be the controversial idea being put forward, that communism, despite its horrors, could tolerate internal contradictions like nationalism because its survival didn't depend on cultural blending in the same way that globalized liberalism often seems to encourage or require.
That leaves us with a really difficult, uncomfortable thought to chew on.
It does. Does preserving tradition, preserving that sense of nationhood, actually require engaging with or maybe even adopting aspects of an ideological system, authoritarianism, collectivism that most of the world today rejects, and for very good reasons? It's a deeply challenging question about the price of preservation.